Yeah. All right, where are you going? Don't leave my class. All right. Let's pick up with Job chapter 38. And this is where we see that the Lord is going to start speaking. He's going to be the technically the fifth friend that Job has and the last one that speaks. One thing I wanted to bring out, it was a good point Mark made at break, was, and just to remind everybody, the connection to a pretty significant text with regards to testing in the book of James. And it's interesting, James is writing to the persecuted church in the first century, but front and center is the idea of testing. So there you have the example. James says, "Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials," or that's the idea of testing, knowing that what? What are we supposed to know? Knowing that the testing of your faith produces, here's another thing that I added, the things that are produced, those things that are double line over here, endurance. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, James says, in order that you may be perfect and complete, or the idea of becoming whole. So the wholeness or the fullness of being a Christian is having the endurance, and the endurance is something that good parents want to produce in their kids. There's a good book that I've read. It's a secular book, but it's called Grit, and it's about one of the chapters talks about parents that allow their kids or encourage their kids to get involved in extracurricular activities in school that cause suffering in their life. That's the hard work of being part of a sports team or being in marching band. But you go through the hard time, but you get something, you earn something like more than just a participation ribbon. You get recognized for having worked hard and doing something as a group. And that produces grit. So the kids that get through college in 4 years are the ones who endured something as a member of a team, of some kind of team, where the coach literally was their taskmaster, pushing them through the pain, saying, you got to do this. Joe, I'm sure you experienced this at boot camp, the hardship of the enduring of going. You remember that? Was that hard?
A long time ago.
Oh, not that long ago, is it? Okay. So the endurance that we go through is part of the helps build the endurance. I think grit and endurance are really, that's the biblical idea of what she writes about in her book called Grit. She studies this and has all kinds of statistics that show. So, but let's talk about what the Lord is going to tell Job here in chapter 38, verse 1. So let's see here. Going back to, here we go. Let's have Grace. Could you read starting in verse 1?
I'm sorry.
Chapter 38, verse 1.
Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said,
Keep going down through until I tell you to stop there.
Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now gird up your loins like a man, and I will ask you, and you instruct me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who set its measurements, since you know? Or who stretched the line on it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy.
Yeah, let's just pause there. So it's interesting how the Lord's responding now to Job, direct, with regards to his situation. One of the things that we see here emerging with the Lord's intervention now, with what the Lord's going to say, is that in this whole scenario here for Job, part of the reality of it is having this. I call it the mystery of suffering. There's an unexplainability to it sometimes, and this is what the Lord is going to do. Hey, guys, you're part of that app that I ordered my coffee through. What's it called? You can order food or order favor. You were my favor guy today. Thanks. All right. So there's the mystery part of it, the question mark that we have in the midst of our suffering. And it's interesting, from this point on in Job 38, we have the Lord bringing emphasis and unpacking that idea for Job. In other words, let's see, starting in chapter 38, verse 4, you read a little bit of it there, Grace, but the creation, in other words, Job's going to lack knowledge, the fullness of knowledge. Being a human being, he's going to have not necessarily the full divine perspective. So what the Lord does is builds his case based on the wonders of creation. Looking through the window, what do we observe out there? Well, there's mystery. There's a lot of stuff going on out there that I don't fully understand. And in light of ourselves and our own situation. So God's going to go to the wonders of the creation itself in chapter 38, verses 4 through 11. The wonders of the heavens, chapter 38, starting in verse 12. He asks, have you ever in your life commanded the morning and caused the dawn to know its place, Job? What's his, that's what God asked. And he's basically saying, but I have, because who I am, Job. I'm God. I'm in charge of that. The rising of the sun, the setting of the sun, the amazing things out there, and even the weather patterns in chapter 38, beginning in verse 22. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail? I have. I made it. I'm sovereign over those things too, by the way, the Lord's going to say. So the weather and all of God's sovereignty and control, he's not giving us the full disclosure of how he does it or even why he does it, but he does it. And then we start to get into the details in chapter 38, beginning in verse 39. He starts to talk about various kinds of animals. Can you hunt the prey for the lion or satisfy the appetite of the young lions when they crouch in their dens and lie in wait from their lair? Do you do that, Job? He says, but I do. That's what the Lord does. So this kind of question mark that extends, and the Lord goes on in surprising, abundant detail with all of the things that Job and anybody reading would be pretty much aware of, the wonders of creation. If you can explain all of this, Job, this natural phenomena, the Lord says to Job, then you're well on your way to fully being able to explain and understand your present situation. See, that's where he's going with this. And finally, as a result of this first wave, there's going to be another wave of this, interestingly. But round one with the Lord, Job responds. And we see that in chapter 40, verses 1 and 2. Patrick had to leave. Jess in the back, why don't we have you read verses 1 and 2 in chapter 40.
Then the Lord said to Job, will the fault finder contend with the Almighty? Let him prove reproofs, God answer it. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am insignificant, and I lay my hand on my mouth. Once I have spoken, and I will not think twice, and I will not.
Yeah, there's the kind of like another high point of the book. Job, we see a little bit of this in this text right here, but in the midst of his suffering, Job gives the right answer, part of the right answer in terms of the human response. You might call it the posture of humility, right? The response of humility in verses 3 through 5 there that Jess read. And isn't that the hard response? The response of humility? Think about how suffering works. If you've ever experienced righteous suffering, let's just say. You're in this situation with Job, maybe not as extreme, but something that's happened. What does suffering do? We respond in very different human ways. Suffering will push our pride, right? We are the pridefulness of our humanity. Our desire to be in control, suffering has a tendency to shake that up a bit, doesn't it? Or how about our desire to fully understand? We want to know everything. We have a desire as part of the fallenness of humanity is to steer our own ship, to be the captain of our own vessel, calling all of our own shots. And by the way, suffering basically says, no, not to that, not when it happens, right? it really shakes up our own little, manicured world, doesn't it? Pushes us to the edge. We want the doctor to come out of the surgery room explaining our situation fully. The suffering of the one in that room will be over in 5 days, and everything will be back to normal. That's what we want to hear, right? Suffering doesn't do that. It doesn't always offer us the easy and convenient answer. Oh, Greg, you're going to have to resign from your job, but yeah, I've got one just around the corner for you. It'll even be better than the first. No, that's not what I heard at first. No, I had to go through the fires for at least a few weeks before I started having any hope for the future again. That was hard. That's what suffering, and I'll add the idea of grief. The idea of grief that we have to remind ourselves is also the ongoing experience for Job. So just last week, when I left class, I was on my way to the car and I checked my inbox, and the email came from my choir director who said that there was a man in our choir. I remember talking to him on Sunday, just the day before class, Sunday night, we had choir rehearsal. Talking to him, his name's Win, and joking around about stuff. And the email from my choir director said he had a aneurysm, blockage to his lungs, stopped breathing the next morning, died. Just like that. This happened last week. So, in a way, I've kind of been up to my neck in all of this real life situation. And, went to the funeral on Thursday and learned about this guy's amazing ministry with Joni Eareckson Tada, the wheelchair ministry that she has. He takes semi-full of trucks, a semi-truck full of wheelchairs to the prison in Angola so that the prisoners can work on these wheelchairs and make them just like new. And then they're distributed to, and we were all sitting in the funeral saying, where these people come from? He was serving as a deacon in our church. He had this wheelchair ministry. He was also involved in the food pantry, and ministry after ministry after ministry is like, the pastor said, he struggled with it. He says, I thought the God was wrong to take him when he did. I'm resisting, this event actually even taking place. My pastor's pretty honest if you get to know him, but we were grieving together as a church. It was just hard stuff. But that pushes us to reality and the reality of our lives. And it's the difficult thing that we have in helping people who are grieving, is come to this position of humility, in the midst of their situation, not feeling the pressure to have to fully understand or fully explain the situation, kind of like Job and his situation. We're not always going to know the divine vantage point when we're in the context of helping people understand. And we can't, I don't think we're never in a situation to assign blame. For a while there, after the event happened in Lafayette for me, being fired from ministry, it didn't happen overnight that I was able to fully forgive the people who were involved in telling me that I had to resign from my job. The guy that led me to Christ was the very same person that called me into his office, his name Tom, to say, yeah, it's good that you leave when the ball's in your court. And that day I had to go home and tell my wife that I had to resign from ministry. And I had a bitterness against him for telling me that, to tell me that, He told me that in love, but at the time it was like the worst thing he could have said to me. But after being out in ministry for a while, God continued to unravel the onion, peel away the edges, peel away the skin of the onion to get down to the core. And he kind of did that with a mirror. Guess who was the problem and why, and who was responsible for leaving Lafayette, having to, it was you, Greg. You're the one. You're the problem. You caused it. It was on you. When I finally heard that for the first time, it was like, oh, Tom was just explaining what was obvious. He was the one. He saw it coming. Unfortunately, he was the one that had to stay behind and still work in that church even after I left, and it was hard for him too. But I didn't know that at the time. He was telling me that in love, like Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 6, like a father disciplines his son. Sometimes that can be hurtful. just as well for the person delivering the bad news. But God's always the one who's sovereign, and like this picture in the midst of our suffering situation, Job would have known this. God's never let go. God doesn't let go of our hand. He's always that father who disciplines, but good parents never let go of their child's hand as they're teaching them to cross the street, So God's role in suffering, we've already seen that kind of on the board. This is evidence of God not letting go of our hand. He led Israel through the wilderness. He was with them every single day. Pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night, So that's always true. But sometimes suffering and adversity is allowed at times. And the intensity levels and the duration, I think that's the mystery part that God's making his point, You're not going to know every jot and tittle of my divine purpose, but you see evidence of it out there. Just understand that that's me at work, and it's still me. It's the same me that's at work in your life, Job, is what the Lord's saying here in this part of Job. So our response needs to be like Job. Ergo, we can't only accept the good if it's from the Lord. We also have to be willing to accept the adversity and understand it. Know that there's a moral value to it, a divine purpose. And I think, again, testing helps us to understand that because there's things connected to the experience of being tested because of the adversity that's brought about in our lives or allowed to happen in our lives. And it's producing these things and this as well. So those are the things that come out of it. And I should add the instruction part of it that we talked about before break. All right, well, we keep going here. The Lord has another round of pointing to the things of creation in chapter 40, beginning in verse 15. God continues to reveal himself, remind Job of how God's revealed himself in creation. Behold now the dinosaurs which I made. No, I'm not. I'm just kidding. Verse 15. Don't get into any controversy here. Don't ask me if that's really a reference to the T-Rex, but the behemoth could be translated just as well, maybe something like a hippo, some large, intimidating, mean creature that God made, which I made as well as you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold now, his strength is in his loins. So these strong living things is an example, and we also see it in the Leviathan over there in chapter 41, are referenced to examples of creatures in God's created, universe, examples of God's creation that demonstrate his strength. Those are the things, and that's the point that God makes here. Let's see. So
is big though, not in controversy, but the setting and time of Job, and as part of the Israeli Hebrew canon, would they have known what a hippo was? Since they're not native to that part of the world, never seen one.
Are you sure? But we don't know the exact context in the setting for the book of Job. Maybe from the vantage point of the author, he's using a word that's rarely used in Hebrew here. So, that's why it's so widely translated. And a lot of us go into this word to try to find, examples. It's just a big animal, But interestingly, in Isaiah chapter 27, Isaiah the prophet uses the same word in chapter 27, verse 1. Both of these words actually are used in that verse to refer to things that are in opposition, the enemy that the Lord's going to, and I think it's the day of the Lord reference there, will come to deal with. So the Leviathan and the behemoth are both referred to there as in opposition to the Lord. So the Lord, so what we have here in chapter 42 as we move on, Job continues, and this is his round 2. He's going to respond again to the Lord. And in chapter 42, verse 1, or verse 2, Job says to the Lord, or answers or responds to the Lord and says, quote, I know that you can do all things. So you've made your point, and that no purpose of mine can be, of thine, yours, the Lord's, can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have declared that which I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me, I did not know. So I'm pointing to the question mark here. Hear now, and I will speak, and I will ask thee, and do thou instruct me. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now my eyes have seen thee. Therefore, I retract. I repent in dust and ashes. So finally, an admission of repentance, and that's what we have here in verse 6. But it's interesting, I think, with the idea there, while I've heard you speak, now I've seen you fully, more fully. The idea there is a fuller revelation of who God is. Maybe that's kind of an analysis that Job is giving. Through this whole experience of suffering, I know more about you, God. I've learned more about you. So I think that's fair to say as an application. That's one of the end products of our testing and refining. Getting out of the way so that more of God can be revealed in our lives, and that's how the Lord works. And that's the hard part about, if any of you are involved in biblical counseling, right? Helping people realize and understand that part of their problem is themselves. That's the hard part, isn't it? Helping people come to that position of humility with regards to their own situation, guiding them that way. That's what it had to be for me, that roadblock in my ministry. I would never be doing what I'm doing now. That's God's, sense of humor that he has. What I'm doing now in terms of helping this institution be organized in a way and work well, all the problems that I help my boss solve at an institution like this. I don't know if you knew, but sometimes there's problems that need to be solved at this place. In the academic side of things, behind the scenes, I can't talk to you about those things because it's confidential. But I'm working behind the scenes to help your experience as a student be all as good as it can be. And there's a lot of people doing that here, but that's what I was not doing when I was in youth ministry. So God has a sense of humor. So finally, we get to the very end.
There was a question.
Nope, I don't have an answer. Sorry, I'm going to move on. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead. What is it?
What exactly is Job repenting of?
I think in the context here, not of being unrighteous, because that's not his problem from the beginning, but by maybe holding on to a little pride, maybe.
So yeah, he said the lack of humility.
Lack of humility. Our pride can be in feeling like, as a Christian, I know how God works. I can speak for God on your situation, kind of like that. Or maybe in Job's situation, feeling like he's had these rounds with these friends, but he's kind of, God is saying, but you don't know me fully. Job says, you're right, God, I don't. So that's the repentance I think that we have. Well, at the end of the book, I mentioned earlier in chapter 42, we'll get right to the end, last chapter, we have this situation, and I spoke to it earlier, but the restoration of Job in verse 10, and the Lord Yahweh, and there's capital O-R-D, by the way. So from the vantage point of the author himself, the author, I think that we've got somebody writing, obviously, from the vantage point of the fullness of the name Yahweh has been revealed. So the Lord restores the fortunes of Job when he prayed for his friends, and the Lord increased all that Job had twofold. Then all of his brothers and his sisters and all who had known him before came to him, and they ate bread in his house, and they were comforted for all of the adversity that the Lord had brought on him. And each one gave him one piece of money and each a ring of gold. And the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than what had happened at his beginning. So there's the statistics that are given here for the fullness of his restoration. And Job died an old man and full of many days. So the fullness of, and I think we kind of, there might be the closest that we get to what the Lord does in terms of blessing us, in terms of covenant relationship, although we're not putting Job in a particular covenant relationship through the lens of Sinai, but in the case of Romans 8:28, I talked about earlier, sometimes that's the verse that's our go-to verse when we're thinking through and helping others evaluate their difficult situation. God causes all things to work together for good. But the caution that I give us is this, and it's the same as what we have here in the book of Job as what we have in the book of Romans chapter 8 for Paul, is that suffering comes before the restoration. The fullness of the suffering occurred for Job, and the testing experience for Job happened before the restoration. I had to go through the hardship of being unemployed as a youth pastor for almost a couple months before I even got a call. You know that I did a lot of thinking during that time, a lot of soul searching during that time. And for Paul and for, I think, the author of Job here, we have a similar situation. And the restoration, I think, here for Job is not necessarily all, it's not just because Job needed to be doubly blessed in order to keep walking with God. I don't think that's the point at all. The restoration here is the restoration of the name Yahweh before the adversary. That's what, the adversary's original plan with Job was, Job is going to mishandle or misrepresent your name if you don't bless him. Well, here's the whole thing. He's not misrepresented the name of God. He's not cursed the name Yahweh. All through this whole experience, he's maintained his integrity before the Lord. So we don't play the game, well, the Lord was just obligated to bless Job. Well, no, I don't think that's the case either. He does it in response to Job's testing and faith, I think. That's probably true as well. So we have to be careful that we don't give people a false impression that Romans 8:28 is a rabbit's foot that basically promises us that we'll never suffer. We dare not go down that path. That's not the case. We should expect suffering. It's written on our job description according to Paul. So these are some big takeaways that we can have with regards to the book. The idea of integrity is what I talked about, and this is helpful for you who are in counseling situations and encouraging others who are going through difficult times. Withhold the temptation to assign blame and to fully understand the why. We saw that's how the book of Job kind of ends in the dialogue between the Lord and Job. Job, you're not going to understand the fullness of how I operate in the universe. Remain honest with God. There's very honest admissions along the way in the book of Job. Refuse to give up the high ground of what is right and just if suffering in an immoral world created by a good. I need to rephrase that, but it kind of gets into D is this point here. Suffering is part of living in a fallen and immoral world created by a good God. So we have to keep our terms clear as we help somebody navigate through suffering. God's not the author of evil, but God does have a role in adversity. There's a huge difference there, obviously. And then suffering can drive us into a deeper knowledge of who God is, and that's the instructional part, the instructional role that we see, and we talked about earlier. All right, well, we're going to move on from the wisdom books now, unless anybody has any questions. No? Yes, sure.
In the chapter 42, and verse 7, the God's response says that the Lord says, I am angry with you and your two friends because you have not spoken what is right about me.
Yes, about comparing their vantage point compared to Job, right?
No, because I realize that they have spoken more than 25 chapters in the Bible. And all of them were right?
Not right.
Not right. They were not necessarily, not everything that they said it was necessarily false.
Yeah, I say this because when I
this is the big idea that they were.
When I started to preach, I used to take literally what the Bible said because it was the Bible, So, so we have to be careful with
Oh, well, that's just interpretation. We work on our interpretation. So, taking that verse in terms of the Lord, he's just got done speaking to Job. And the contrast, I think, is made between Job's response, that was brief but accurate, and the basic thrust of all of the advice that has just come from the previous 25 or so chapters from these four friends. basically all comes back to the big idea, the big thesis that they are offering is that, Job, you need to repent or find something that, to repent about in your life because God is punishing you. And God's showing up saying, no, that's not what is happening here. God is not punishing Job. God is tapped Job on the shoulder to go through the experience of testing and refining with regards to his faith. God is allowing Job to experience adversity for this very purpose. And that's the whole point of the book. And none of the friends got there. None of the friends got close to that. They're caught in their the ancient Near Eastern worldview. The gods punish the wicked and reward the righteous. And that's not, yeah.
Why does he name only 3 friends there in that verse and not 4? Why doesn't he say you and your 3 friends? He says 2 friends.
Think about that one.
I've always wondered why Elihu, it seemed like his advice was better than the other 3, but I always
may have to maybe think about that. It's been a while since Is there a subtle hint there that the Lord is acknowledging one of the 4 as being okay, maybe acceptable, and the others, I don't know. I have to look at that.
Numerous times, and every time I get to the end, I'm like, well, it seems like Elihu was at least sort of on.
Was he the? Yeah, he was the brief. Was he the?
But he's the one that you said was dropping off his kids at first, and then came later. So but
all right.
Anyway.
Well, we'll have to reserve that one. Yeah, I'll have to think about that one. Right. Well, let's move on to. And remember, the whole reason I took a little detour with the 5, the books of wisdom, Psalms, Proverbs. Remember, we built those into the context of where they fit in the timeline. So those books were largely the product of the time of the monarchy, David, Solomon, the united monarchy. And then we get into Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. And those books, if you go with me, are stemming from the ministry of Solomon near the end of his life. And then we have Job, which fits into the genre of wisdom books. So it's a practical ministry book to the community of faith for answering a very specific question, like the book of Ecclesiastes, like the book of Song of Solomon. So they're all very practical books. They are coming out of the big ideas that all of these wisdom books are the byproduct of a covenant community at work. King listening to his covenant faithful. Wisdom is being produced. Reflection is happening on life. Evaluations are taking place. And these are becoming deposits of wisdom for a kingdom that is seeking to, understand what does it look like to walk with God and to experience covenant relationships. So that's why I dropped them in where we do after the history books. Now we've got this phenomena that takes place, if you remember, where the book of Kings ends is now Judah is in exile. We kind of stopped there. So if you cross over from Kings to Ezra and Nehemiah, these books are going to come in and evaluate the historical events that take place after a 70-year break in history. So 70 years approximately in exile in Babylon. Persia, the country of Persia, is going to defeat the Babylonians. And this transition happens where now we're going to start to see the historical events that take place that allow the Israelites to come out of exile and come back after that 70-year period to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the walls, but more importantly, to rebuild the covenant community. So that's where we're going with these books. So Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and then we'll get to Chronicles, which is the last history that was written, a recasting of the history written earlier, Samuel, Kings, but through a different theological lens, with the intention of a different audience for that historical recasting. So that's where we're going to finish out the semester. So like I said, we saw this history earlier in some of our earlier slides with the growth of the Babylonian Empire. Judah is just a little blip on the map with regards to Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian kings that come down And eventually we saw the demise, the destruction of Jerusalem in 586. Now, one of the things that we saw even before that, we saw the fall of Samaria, or Israel in the north, after the Assyrians destroyed Samaria, the capital city. And one of the things that we saw, the capital city of Samaria destroyed in 722. Remember, that was the capital city of Israel, the northern nation. Now we've got the southern nation of Judah. Remember, the Assyrians took people away to Assyria. They also sent people in to kind of take over and run the operation. So non-Israelites would come in from Assyria. And we saw this if we turn back to 2 Kings chapter 17. Let's turn there in 2 Kings chapter 17. Second Kings chapter 17, beginning in verse 24. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cuthah, and from Avah, and from Hamath, and from Shepharvaim, and he settled them in the cities of Samaria in place of the sons of Israel. So they possessed Samaria and lived in its cities. The leftovers from those people become the Samaritans down the road. And so we meet up with these Samaritans in the early stages of being Samaritans. We pick up with them in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. That's my point here. So again, in verse 27 through 29. See, these people who come in and settle are pagans coming in from Assyria. And they live and they establish the community there in the north. And they live and mingle with the poorest of the poor, who are left behind from the Assyrian conquest. So now what you've got is in a more extreme situation. You've got some people around who are still having church, but in a very syncretistic kind of way, right? Because that's the whole reason they went into exile. But then more pagans come in and say, we're going to have church with you. So eventually over time is that they have kind of a very offshoot version of what it means to be a Hebrew or an Israelite. They only use or read the first 5 books of the Old Testament. What we have later is that their Bible becomes the Samaritan Pentateuch, right? And that's what they use to have church. So really what we have for this 200-year period, they've been practicing syncretistic religion before the exiles from Judah come out of their exilic experience and return. So this is who we meet up with here. It's an actual picture, a Polaroid picture of the actual guys hanging around. No, I'm just kidding. So now what we have to do is remind ourselves of another thing. So all this is kind of getting us set up for the storyline of the book of the history books, Ezra and Nehemiah. Now what we want to do is change gears a little bit and ask ourselves this question. What effects did the Babylonian exile have on those who went into exile 70 years before? So remember the deportation of, now we're talking about the people of Judah, the southern nation. Happened in 3 waves. Do you remember that? We saw that Daniel and his friends go into exile in the first wave. We saw that Ezekiel, the prophet Ezekiel, goes in the second deportation. And then finally, the third deportation represents the destruction of Jerusalem, the capital city, in 586. So 3 waves. If we turn to the book of the book of Ezekiel, let's turn there in chapter 33. I'm going to be in Ezekiel for a little bit because Ezekiel gives us a nice window in to this exilic community in some surprising ways. So I want us to see this in chapter 33, verse 21. Now it came about in the 12th year of our exile, so 12 years in, on the 5th of the 10th month, that the refugees from Jerusalem came to me saying, the city's been taken. Now the hand of the Lord had been upon me in the evening, Before the refugees came, that's the prophet speaking, and he opened my mouth at the time they came to me in the morning. So my mouth was opened, and I no longer was speechless. So he loses his, he had lost, remember, he had gone dumb for a period of time, so now he starts to speak. Just in time for the news that came back from the destruction of Jerusalem, the capital city. So now the prophet Ezekiel is going to break the bad news to the exiles who are there. They've been there for 12 years, and finally they hear the devastating news of the destruction of Jerusalem. All right, now that's what we have in Ezekiel 33. But even from the beginning of Ezekiel's ministry, let's turn back to Ezekiel chapter 4. And early on, Ezekiel has already been at work as a prophet. So with this prophet hat on, he had already predicted this long Babylonian siege in chapter 4. And that's the whole, we won't read all the way down through verse 13, but this is where the prophet is going to lay down on his side for a long time. He's going to build a little replica of the city of Jerusalem, and basically people, in my mind, I picture him demonstrating with a visual display, little Lego set or whatever, little toy soldiers on the ground, but showing them what it looks like for Jerusalem to be sieged. And then he has a little cookout, and he kind of demonstrates, well, here's what it's like to be in siege. Food's going to be rationed. You remember that, our discussion? Those of you who have had me for prophets. Verse 10, and the food which you eat shall be 20 shekels a day by weight, and you shall eat it from time to time. And then the rationing of water in verse 11, and you shall eat it as barley cakes, have it baked it in their sight over, you all know the punchline, right? Human dung. That's what he says there in verse 12, and that's the tragic thing. That's the, are you kidding me? Moment for anybody hearing and actually seeing, and possibly all the senses are involved now in this message that he's preaching. Well, what happens when you run out in the horrors of siege? When you run out of wood to cook your food with, you start to use animal dung. And what happens when you eat all your animals when you're in siege? When all the animals are gone, then the only fuel that you have left is your own dried dung. It's terrible. That's horrific. That's graphic, and it grabs you, and it would have grabbed his audience, Ezekiel. So he's pulling out all the stops early on in his prophetic ministry, Ezekiel, but he's their pastor. He's the pastor to the exiles. We'll talk about that in OT3. Unfortunately, not this summer. I'm not teaching, but I'll be teaching it again in the fall, OT3. And that's what we have. Ezekiel is working behind the scenes. And you remember another book that's working behind the scenes here is the author of Kings. The history of Kings was written for this audience that's gone into exile. We said that earlier. So all of these voices are getting and working to get the attention of the exiles who have gone into Babylon. So this is all getting us set up to understand what would have precipitated or caused or gotten the attention of a group who have gone into exile because they're being, these group of half-baked pagans, right? Syncretistic, practicing syncretists. They went into exile, the majority. Why would they even have any motivation at all to go back to Jerusalem? That's the point I'm trying to build to. Well, we see that in the particular messages that Ezekiel gives them. If you study the whole book of Ezekiel, which we will in the fall, we see that Ezekiel focuses the attention of this group on the Lord's future for them. So let's take a look and remind ourselves in Ezekiel chapter 37. Let's turn there. And this is an important chapter. It's the dry bones. Dim bones, dim bones, dim dry bones. That whole childhood song that we learned. But we know what happens to the dry bones. They become alive. So we made that point in Prophets when we talked about this. When God's people, Judah, the nation of Judah, ceases to exist as a nation, they literally die. When they lose capital city, when they lose their temple, and when they lose their king. They cease to exist. They lose all identity, all national identity. The only thing they have intact is their spiritual identity. And they're even kind of losing hope in that. So the prophet here encourages the socks off of them, right? Well, let me talk to you about a vision that I had, dry bones. And guess what God does to the dry bones? He's going to restore the nation of Israel. That's what he does here. And guess what it's built on the back of? And we see that in verse 24. So this is where I'm going to start reading. Chapter 37, verse 24. And my servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd, and they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. And they shall live on the land that I gave to Jacob my servant, in which your fathers lived. And they will live on it, they and their sons' sons forever. And David my servant shall be their king, or their prince forever. And I will make a covenant of peace with them, and it will be an everlasting, forever covenant with them. And I will place them in myself, and I'll multiply them, and I'll set my temple, my tabernacle, my sanctuary in their midst forever. My dwelling place also will be with them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And nations will know that I am Yahweh, who sanctifies Israel, when my sanctuary, my tabernacle, will be in their midst forever. Sign me up. I'm ready to go, is what the response he would have gotten from some of those who had gone into exile, right? So the faithful remnant, he grows this group. So he's growing this group. That's what Ezekiel does. And that's why there's so much detail here. You know, this reference here to the tabernacle, well, this is what he describes here beginning in chapter 40. The vision now that he has with regards to this tabernacle, this temple, right? The tabernacle. And guess what? This group's dead set on rebuilding when they get back to Jerusalem, right? They're going to go back to rebuild the tabernacle. It comes from Ezekiel's vision. God's behind this. He's not giving up on us. He's got a future for us. And in order to experience that future, we, the faithful remnant, we've got to make this long 900-mile journey by foot back to Jerusalem from where we are in Babylon. And that's what we have here. So he gives them, Ezekiel, the whole, from his prophetic ministry, he gives them the whole theology of hope. Why do we go back? It's from Ezekiel. To go back and be God's people, to experience the blessing of the Lord, and to get back to business of being a covenant community. Central around a rebuilt temple, which you'll do. And after that, experience the Lord's blessing, his provision, his protection, and all the things that we used to have way back when, more than 70 years ago, back when we were a nation. So that's exactly what happens in such a way that we estimate, but some 50,000 plus of the exiles return. Not everybody does. Still, we've got the story of Esther. None of those Israelites return. But some of them stay behind. Daniel's going to stay behind. He's not going to come back with any of the groups that come back. But 50,000 do. And this was the group that came back. So this is the backdrop of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. They're going to come back to get back to the business of rebuilding their covenant community. On the effectiveness of the preaching ministry of one prophet, namely Ezekiel, as well as the history writer, the theologian behind the books of Kings. You know, this group needed to be told very clearly, why are we here? We talked about that when we got to the end of Kings. So there's some other examples of how biblical authors benefited this group that came back. Let's turn to the book of Psalms and remind ourselves of the group of Psalms, starting in Psalm 120. Here we go. Psalm 120. And we called this little group here from Psalm 120 to Psalm 134 the Psalms of Ascent, or the Psalms of going up, you might say. Psalm 122, verse 1, this was probably sung on actual pilgrimage to go back to Jerusalem. I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. Our feet are standing within your gates, O Jerusalem. I can just smell it. Jerusalem that is built as a city that is compact together, to which the tribes go up. Not just us, but all the tribes of the world. Even the tribes of the Lord, This is an ordinance for Israel, to give thanks in the name of the Lord. For their thrones were set for judgment, the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May they prosper who love you, that is Jerusalem. May peace be within your walls and prosperity within your palaces. For the sake of my brothers and my friends, I will say now, may peace be within you. For the sake of the house of the Lord, our God, I will seek your good. That's a psalm of ascent. And you see there, sometimes there's, really some exciting raw emotion, right, that's captured in these psalms. Psalms 126, that's another one. This is one that's a little bit different kind of emotion. But Psalm 126 is another psalm that I think fits this context well. When the Lord brought back the captive ones of Zion, we were like those who were in a dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter. Then our tongue with joyful shouting. Then they said among the nations, the Lord has done these great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. Restore our captivity, O Lord, as the streams in the south. Those who sow in tears shall reap with joyful shouting. He who goes forth weeping, carrying his bag of seed, shall indeed come back again with a shout of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. So there'll be a harvest again. All of these things will come about, this restoration. So these songs are celebrating that. All right, well, let's move on. Just a little bit on the path that they took in the deportations that took place. I'll go over here. So the first one, and this comes out of Nehemiah 1:9, but the first of the route of Zerubbabel was in the red. So that's the very first route. And then there's another couple of different groups that came back under Ezra and then Nehemiah. So Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, different, you might say, reverse deportations now, and slightly different paths, but coming out of different places in and around Babylon. Interestingly, that's basically the same path that Abraham took. It's really interesting that Abraham would have followed that same journey, right? Out of his hometown of Ur, remember that? All the way up to Haran, and then he takes this path. But basically, this is the path that gets you from that place in Babylon to the Promised Land, because it follows the water sources. It follows the Euphrates all the way up until it gets up to Aleppo, and then eventually you grab some of the water sources down into the Promised Land. So you needed to be near water when you're in the middle of that dry area of the world. If you go a straight line distance from Babylon to Jerusalem, across here, which is not really conducive to traveling with large groups of people, especially if you've got little ones, that's 500 miles. But to add on to the, following the water route increases it to about 900 miles. All right? Now, when I moved down to Texas from my hometown in Indianapolis, guess how many miles that was? 900 miles. I can't imagine walking that distance for any reason. So you can understand just the distance alone and the motivation for walking that far, putting, the group at harm's way. It's not a safe place to walk. Back then it wasn't, because of people, hiding and looking to steal or rob you along the way, or perhaps get caught in a crossfire of a battle. That's you've got to be dead serious on your spiritual reason for making that journey back. So all of this kind of to make this case that we've got a serious group of people starting the book of Ezra, going back to rebuild under the leadership of Zerubbabel, the appointed governor at that time. All right, so here's how the two books play out in terms of the text that focuses on, or at least the chapters of Ezra and the whole book of Nehemiah, how they kind of, pan out here. You've got the first 6 chapters of Ezra, largely unpacking the historical period under the leadership of Zerubbabel, with the focus of rebuilding the temple. Then you have the last 3 chapters of the book of Ezra, focusing on Ezra and his intention or his purpose. He's largely, you think of it this way, focused on rebuilding the spiritual lives of the people. So there's a lot of rebuilding that goes on in these 2 books. First is the temple under Zerubbabel. Then you've got the spiritual rebuilding or reformation of the people the covenant community under Ezra, the priest. And then you've got Nehemiah, who has a specific intention of helping protect the people through the focus of rebuilding the walls around the city. And in between those groupings of chapters, you've got, kind of gaps. So historical gaps, meaning time is, and things are happening outside of what's recorded in those books or those chapters. But that's where we drop in significant books, like the book of Esther. That's going to fall into that gap in between the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. You can pretty much drop in the entire book of Esther in terms of the events that take place. And then you've got some parallel things that I've added. Haggai and Zechariah, post-exilic prophets, and their prophetic ministry is going to overlap with this first part of the book of Zerubbabel, not the book of Zerubbabel, but Ezra chapter 1 through 6, and the events that take place there. Because they're prophets God raises up to bring spiritual encouragement to the temple rebuilders, especially when they run up against opposition or discouragement. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah. So we'll talk about that. But then even world events that are taking place, largely the rising and falling of who's in charge of the ancient world. So now you've got the Persian kingdom extending all the way through, starting with Cyrus, and then the prophet Daniel, overlapping with Cyrus II and Darius I. And then you have, during Esther's reign, Xerxes I, or Ahasuerus is his biblical name, and then Artaxerxes I, and then we have Darius II. It gets a little confusing, keeping track of all those guys.
But who are some of the exilic prophets? We talked about
Those post-exilic prophets?
the exilic, when they're in exile.
Oh, the exilic prophets, the ones that are active during that time would be Daniel. He's active, obviously, behind the scenes, overlapping the Babylonian and Persian period. Prophet Ezekiel. Really, that's it. That's it. You've got the author of Kings, writing his history, I think, intended for that audience. And Jeremiah is active all the way up to the fall of Jerusalem, but then we don't hear from him anymore. He goes to Egypt. He's kidnapped, for all practical purposes, and taken to Egypt with the poorest of the poor who are left behind in Jerusalem. That's basically it. So, Jeremiah is technically active to the exiles because he does write that one chapter intended for those who have gone to exile. I think it's 39, the chapter that he writes, like Lamentations. He's intending, he writes Lamentations, I think, which is intended for those who are grieving in exile. So that's one, I guess technically Jeremiah is active to minister to that group that's gone into exile. So, yep. All right, well, let's see here. What do we have here? Let's see. Okay, what do I want to do here? What time is it? 5:15? Okay, I think I'm going to call an audible. Nothing that you would be too discouraged or disappointed. Maybe some of you guys over here will be discouraged and disappointed. Would you, if I called class?
You can't call it a Hail Mary, though.
Well, any questions up to? I just want to. We've got plenty of time in the weeks ahead to finish. I'm not feeling overwhelmed with getting us to the finish line in terms of what I want to cover in class. So, if we can take a little scenic overlook break, now we can. I don't feel we covered a lot of ground tonight. That's the thing. So I think some of you are kind of looking ready for a nap. So just to be honest. So let's call class, and we'll pick up with Ezra and Nehemiah next week. And then the week after that, we'll have plenty of time to cover Esther and the books of 1st and 2nd Chronicles, with a little bit of time at the end to have a little review and get us ready for the final exam. So, all right, thanks for your attention tonight.